Are remote employees losing the war on return to the office? Well, stick around. In this video, I'll share with you what I think. Hey everybody, it's Brian from Life After Layoff, and today I want to talk to you about everybody's favorite subject, remote work. And if you're somebody that is looking for remote jobs, you may have noticed that the job market seems to have gotten a little bit tighter in that regard recently. Well, there's a reason for it. In this video, I'm going to break down what's going on with remote work and maybe what you can expect going forward. But before we get too far into it, if you're interested in learning how to reclaim control and start to act like the CEO of your career, make sure you sign up for my free weekly newsletter. And in it, I share concise and actionable tips on how to approach your career with a higher degree of confidence and strategy. So make sure you check it out and keep in mind it's absolutely free. So what's going on in this remote first workplace? And I know that there's a lot of people out there who probably don't have the ability to work a remote job and are probably not feeling too sympathetic for people who are being forced back into the office. But the reality of the market is that there was a long period of time where a lot of people moved to remote first. If you keep in mind how we got here, going back to 2020 seemed to be the big increase or the big spike in remote work. The reason being is that it was in direct response to the pandemic crisis, but it wasn't a widely accepted practice, and there weren't a ton of jobs that were remote first. There were certain companies that you kind of knew to target, but in general, they were pretty coveted. Suddenly in 2020, everything starts shutting down because of the pandemic, and we're all asked to do our part. Now, people who had traditionally not worked in a remote setting, or companies that had not had a remote first culture, we're experimenting with the concept of remote work. And essentially, a lot of governments came out with mandates that you had to work remote. You couldn't even go into the office if you wanted to. And these companies obviously want to stay in business. So they shifted their workforces, and a lot of people suddenly found themselves working remotely. And it wasn't just as easy as flip a switch. There's a lot of logistics into adjusting your life to work remote first, especially if you're somebody that's never done it or never taken that into consideration. Working parents certainly know the challenges around daycare and the logistics surrounding that. And because it happened so subtly, a lot of people started to scramble to try to figure those things out. So this idea of moving to a remote first workplace was not necessarily an easy one for some people to adapt to, but eventually they figured it out and they learned how to live with it. But it was a major uprooting of their lives. And the interesting thing that they discovered was you can actually be pretty effective working remotely, at least during this period of time. Now, of course, the whole market kind of went crazy. We all know the story. I've talked about it in a lot of different videos. But through all these iterations of quiet quitting and great resignations and all of this stuff, when you're working behind a desk remotely, it's a little harder for managers to really have an understanding of what their workforces do. Now, keep in mind, I'm a proponent of remote work, and I've worked remote for the better part of the last 6 or 7 years in my career. So it was something that was really easy for me to do because I was already kind of doing it. But for a lot of people, it became a challenge. And the idea of being motivated without having somebody breathing down your neck, for some people kind of found it to be a bit of a challenge. Not to mention, you lose out on the camaraderie and you lose out on some of the interactions. And I'm not going to sit here and debate the merits of whether or not those things are real, but there is certainly some value in being able to go in and collaborate with your team members in a face-to-face setting. So I don't want to discount that component of it. And I think for somebody that's early in their career, they're put at a serious disadvantage if they're remote first and not having the chance to go into an office to learn the ropes, to meet the key players, to see how people behave in meetings and in what the protocol is. I couldn't imagine graduating from college in 2020 and coming into a workplace that was just so foreign to what we all had before that. So for those folks, kudos to you for being able to manage this, because it's been a very tricky time to get started in a career. But it seemed like the economy almost overnight turned back on again and everything screamed back into motion. And now you've got these employers who've paid for these buildings downtown, and they have these leases, and they have this lack of collaboration, or at least that's what they're saying. And now you've got people forcing the issue. You've got CEOs that are publicly coming out and demanding that their workers come back into the office. And as hard as it was from shifting from being in an office to being remote, the same level of shifting back has become just as difficult. In fact, in some cases, it might even be more difficult because you've got the daycare situation, you've got commutes figured out, you've set up your life in such a way that suddenly if you have a commute, it could be really disruptive. Not to mention, a lot of people, because of the way the housing market has been, we all know skyrocketing interest rates and prices of houses have gone through the roof. Affordability is a real issue. And a lot of people decided to move away from the big city, especially during a pandemic where there's a lot of uncertainty and people want to be in a more safe environment and trying to get to cheaper housing. So they might have moved away or further out from the city. And suddenly when you're forced back into the office, that's a major deal. Now you might have a commute that originally was only 30 minutes that now is 2.5, 3 hours, maybe even further. Or in some cases, it might not even be reasonable for you to go back in based on where you've decided to live. Whose fault is that? I don't know. And I don't know if you can place blame anywhere. But the reality is that companies who are forcing their employees back into the office now have to face this issue with workforce that's now much more distributed than it once was. And it is causing some real life issues. And there are some cases where employees are making a stand. They're going on strike or trying to organize or protest, I guess maybe you could call it. And they're trying to fight back against the machine, for lack of a better term. The reality is, though, is whoever's signing your paycheck is going to win that battle 100 times out of 100. Unless you're somebody that's a very strong and unique background that's highly coveted by employers, you may find yourself on the losing end of that tug of war should you decide to wage one with your boss. But in fact, that's what's happening across the industry. It does seem like employers are waging war with their employees to force them back into the office. And it's this whiplash of the employment pendulum swinging back and forth, and it's screaming back towards the employer who is now reclaiming or reasserting their power in this dynamic. So they're using studies to their advantage. In fact, there was one here that says remote work revolution is crashing into cold hard reality. Research is finding that remote workers are less productive at home. And in this working paper published by the National Bureau of Economic Research, they suggest that in India, people who worked from home were 18% less productive than those in the office. And furthermore, recent analysis of multiple studies have found that fully remote workers were 10 to 20% less productive than their in-office counterparts. And this finding comes as the US labor productivity has slowed in recent quarters. So obviously you've got people like Mark Zuckerberg and other CEOs, I'm thinking in the finance industry, big banking, are making a big stink about forcing people back into the office, and they're starting to track metrics around it. And ironically, you even have the company Zoom, which has a product which promotes remote work, and they're forcing people back into their offices. So what does that tell you about the state of this war that's being waged on the employee? I don't think it's going to end very well for people who are remote. Furthermore, you've got companies like Amazon who are warning employees that if they don't come into the office frequently enough, that there are actually going to be some disciplinary consequences and you could lose your job. So there's been some screenshots of emails circulating on social media that shows Amazon employees are receiving these messages about not meeting expectations for joining your colleagues back in the office at least 3 days a week, even though your assigned building is ready. And they're saying what their expectation is that we expect you to come into the office 3 or more days for a week from now on. And if you don't do that, again, there potentially could be some pretty negative consequences there. And when you're in an employee-driven economy, in other words, the pendulum of power is swinging towards the employee like we saw in 2021, it's probably something that you can get away with pushing back on more if you're the employee. But as the pendulum shifts and there are more people looking for jobs and there are jobs available, or at least high quality jobs available, the people who have those high quality jobs really have a decision to make. And if you're somebody that moved really far out, that might be a real serious dilemma. What do you do? I personally have some coaching clients who've had to make some difficult decisions and sell houses and move across the country back to where the work is, and in some cases in geographic areas that they're not super thrilled about. And that's just the reality of the market in today's economy. So what it boils down to is that there are some companies that seem to be really pushing this return to office, and they're doing it in a very forceful manner. And if you don't comply, you might have a very difficult decision to make. And because there's less and less companies that are promoting a remote option or being remote first work culture, those jobs become very coveted. And when a job gets posted, it's like a feeding frenzy. Everybody's piling on top of it. And that's where you're seeing some of these jobs that have 700, 800, 900 applications, especially if it's a job that was historically a remote job, like recruiting jobs, for example, especially in 2020 when everybody was remote. And a lot of recruiters got used to working remotely, and now they're being forced back into the office. And so when you see a remote recruiting job pop up, it's like you kind of get your popcorn. You better make sure that you've got a really strong resume and a very strong salesmanship game when you get into the interview process, because you're going to have to market yourself expertly in order to stand out in those cases. So where I think this is heading is, because there are a lot more companies that have empty office buildings and they've got all this infrastructure in place that they've invested in, like the Amazon building here in Nashville. They spent, I don't know how many millions of dollars they spent on this beautiful building, and it happened to open up right during the beginning of the pandemic, so there's like nobody in this office building. But I know that they're one of the ones that was really looking to force the return to the office, and you've got this major infrastructure that they're paying for, and then they're pitching this idea of this collaboration and how the company is going to perform better with the face-to-face interaction. And if you care about your career, then you need to be in the office. You need to be building those networks. On some level, I probably would agree with that. If you truly want to supercharge your career, you probably do need to have at least some face time with the right kinds of people. It is a political game, whether we like it or not. But that's another sales pitch that they're using to justify bringing people back in. No, there's companies that do remote first, and that's all they have. They don't even have offices, and they seem to do just fine. If you're a job seeker, you're probably going to have to really start targeting more carefully or more specifically those companies that still have a remote first work culture. Secondly, you're probably going to need to be located near where a population base is, where there's jobs, because like it or not, even jobs that might have a remote option will probably still be requiring you to come into the office on some sort of a hybrid model, at least at some point. So if I'm somebody that moved out into the boondocks or the sticks and was comfortable working remotely, I better start coming up with a plan B. Either I need to think about getting closer to a city that has jobs, or I need to figure out an employment situation that is going to be more stable, or maybe even set up some side hustles to help alleviate it in case you find yourself on the wrong end of an employment decision. I could see that being a criteria for things like layoffs and unfortunately in performance appraisals and that sort of thing. If you're not showing up to the office and there's a mandate like this Amazon one, I'm curious if there's any Amazonians who have actually received this email, and have you pushed it? Do you have any anecdotal stories to tell about people who are going to experience adverse employment decisions based on the fact that they're not coming into the office? I'm curious. So if you work at Amazon and you've received this, let me know in the comments. But in general, I would recommend that you really look at how to make your skills as unique as possible so that you stand out, so that you can still dictate those terms and conditions with an employer that's going to value them. Because if you've got the same skill set as everybody else in the market and there's no differentiation, it's a lot harder to convince an employer to make an exception for you if you don't bring the goods. Unless if you need help in your job search, you know how to reach me. I've got websites, I've got training tools and all that kind of stuff. So anyway, that's my long rambling take on the state of remote work and where I think it's headed. I don't think it's going to get necessarily any better, so buckle up. Anyway, as always, I appreciate you listening to my rambling, and we'll see you on the next one.